I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The hinge, rusted from the damp coastal air that permeated our lives, had always whined a protest when opened or shut. But Father had left it just ajar, creating a narrow slit of sound through which their voices traveled, brittle and sharp. My stepmother, Beatrice, spoke first, her tone the familiar blend of cloying sweetness and steel. Serafina is a vision. The Duke of Allister has refused every girl of quality for 7 years, but he has not yet seen our Serafina. She is a porcelain doll on a velvet tray, a perfect jewel. My father's reply was a low rumble, the sound of a man worn down to his foundations. And Alara? What of Alara? A sigh, thin and impatient. What of her? She will accompany us, of course. A plain, quiet girl in the background makes a beautiful one shine all the brighter. She can be useful. See to Serafina's gowns. Fetch her things. No one will notice her. They never do. No one will notice her. The words did not wound me. They were simply a statement of fact, as true and as constant as the tide. I was the second daughter, the one who had inherited my mother's quiet nature and thoughtful face, but none of her legendary beauty. Serafina had received that portion in full, a bounty of spun gold hair and eyes the color of a summer sky that left none for me. I was the shadow that proved the sunbeam's brilliance, a fact I had accepted long ago. My world was one of books and ledgers, of the quiet satisfaction of a well-managed household account and the silent company of characters on a page. I did not belong in a drawing room, and I certainly did not belong in the orbit of a man like the Duke of Allister. He was a legend, a creature of myth more than a man. For 7 years since the tragic death of his young wife in a riding accident, he had remained sequestered in his fortress of a home, Blackwood Manor. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and, by all accounts, impossibly cold. A procession of the country's most beautiful and well-dowered young women had been paraded before him at the rare local assembly he was forced to attend, only to be met with a gaze of glacial indifference. He was the great, unconquerable peak, and my father, teetering on the precipice of financial ruin, was determined that Serafina would be the one to finally plant a flag upon its summit. Our journey north was a study in contrasts. Serafina was cocooned in furs and fretted over, while I was wedged between trunks, my lap a repository for forgotten reticules and Beatrice's yapping dog. We were not to stay at an inn, or with some distant, well-to-do cousin. No, our destination was a derelict cottage on the very edge of the Duke's vast estate, a property my father had acquired in some forgotten transaction years ago. It was a strategic move, Beatrice had explained, one that would place Serafina directly in the Duke's path without the vulgarity of a formal approach. We were to be his new, intriguing neighbors. The cottage was a miserable affair, a stone hovel that wept damp down its interior walls and smelled of mice and regret. A single stooped woman named Martha was its only keeper, her hands gnarled and her eyes perpetually downcast. While Beatrice and Serafina surveyed the cramped rooms with undisguised horror, I found the hearth, cleared the old ash, and began the methodical work of laying a new fire. It was what I did. I found the problem, the cold spot, the disarray, and I quietly set about fixing it. It was 2 days later, while I was on my knees in the pathetic excuse for a garden attempting to coax some life from a patch of withered herbs, that I saw him for the first time. He came upon us not in a grand carriage, but on a massive black horse, a figure of stark severity against the gray sky. He was not handsome in the way of the young dandies in London. His face was all harsh lines and angles, his jaw set, his dark hair unadorned. He was dressed for riding, in impeccable but practical attire that spoke of a man who used his land rather than merely owning it. He was power, distilled and contained. He was magnificent. My father and Beatrice scurried out of the cottage, their smiles brittle and overly bright. Serafina was hastily pushed forward, a vision in pale blue, her golden curls arranged just so. I remained where I was, half hidden by a straggling rosebush, a smudge of dirt on my cheek. He dismounted with a fluid grace that was almost unnerving, handing the reins to a groom who seemed to have materialized from the mist. His attention, as expected, was on my father. His voice was a low baritone, colder than the North Sea. "You are Mr. Croft. You have taken up residence at Hollyhock Cottage." It was a statement, not a question. "Your Grace," my father stammered, bowing low. "A pleasure. May I present my wife, Beatrice, and my daughter, Serafina?" The Duke's eyes, a startlingly clear and penetrating gray, swept over Serafina. It was a glance, nothing more. The polite sweep of a nobleman acknowledging a presence. There was no flicker of interest, no pause. It was the same look he had given the peeling paint on the cottage door. My stepmother's smile tightened at the edges. And then it happened. His gaze moved past them, past the carefully constructed tableau of beauty and ambition, and landed on me. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep he had given my sister. It was a direct, focused, and utterly still look. He did not smile, he did not nod, he simply watched me. I was on my knees, my hands covered in soil, a stray strand of my plain brown hair stuck to my forehead. I was nothing. I was the person no one ever noticed. But he noticed. His eyes held mine for a breath, 2, 3, and in that unnerving space of time, I felt something I had never felt before. Seen. It was not a pleasant sensation. It was like being pinned by a beam of winter sunlight, exposed and cold and utterly transparent. I broke the gaze first, dropping my eyes back to the stubborn weeds, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. He did not ask my name. He concluded his clipped, formal business with my father, something about a disputed property line, and was gone as swiftly as he had appeared. That night, Beatrice was furious. He did not even look at her. All this effort for nothing. But I knew she was wrong. He had looked. He had just looked at the wrong person. A week passed in damp misery. Serafina grew bored and petulant. My father grew more desperate. I spent my time trying to make the cottage habitable, mending torn linens and making endless cups of tea. Then a footman in the Duke of Allister's livery arrived with an invitation. Not for dinner, not for a ball, but an invitation to view the library at Blackwood Manor. The note specified that the Duke had heard of Mr. Croft's learned daughter and thought she might appreciate his collection. The silence in our small sitting room was profound. Beatrice snatched the note. Learned daughter? He must mean Serafina. She had a French tutor for a year. But the footman, a ramrod-straight man with an impassive face, cleared his throat. His Grace was specific, madam. The invitation is for Miss Elara Croft. I felt the weight of 3 sets of astonished eyes upon me. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. But the Duke's handwriting on the card was firm and clear. The meeting in the garden had not been a fluke. That strange, intense gaze had meant something, and the thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. This was a disruption of the natural order of things. The visit to Blackwood was an exercise in exquisite torture. I was dressed in my only good gown, a drab gray wool that made me feel like a moth. Serafina, forced to attend as my chaperone along with Beatrice, was incandescent in emerald green, her beauty a constant, painful reproach. The manor was not a home. It was a monument, vast, silent, and intimidating, its hallways lined with the portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The Duke met us in the Great Hall. He was as severe and remote as I remembered, but when his eyes found mine, the same unnerving focus was there. He gave a curt nod to my stepmother and sister, then turned to me. "Miss Croft, I trust your journey was not unpleasant." "It was not, Your Grace," I managed, my voice a whisper. He led us to the library, and as the great oak doors swung open, I forgot to be afraid. I forgot my gray dress and my plain face. I forgot my scheming family. I drew in a breath that was slow and deep and shaking. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. 2 stories of books reaching up into the shadows with a rolling ladder to reach the highest shelves. The air smelled of leather and paper and beeswax, a holy trinity of scents that was more comforting to me than any perfume. Long slanted ribbons of light from the tall arched windows illuminated floating dust motes, turning them into a wavering partition of gold. "You approve," he stated, his voice closer than I expected. I turned to find him standing beside me, his gaze not on the books, but on my face. "It is more than I could have imagined," I said, my earnestness overriding my shyness. "A room like this is not a collection. It is a life's work, a conversation across centuries." A flicker of something, surprise, interest, crossed his features. "An astute observation. Most visitors comment on the expense." He gestured towards a shelf. "My father preferred history. My grandfather, the classics. I have a fondness for philosophy and agricultural treatises." Beatrice, sensing she was losing control of the situation, propelled Serafina forward. "My Serafina adores poetry, Your Grace." The Duke did not even look at her. His eyes remained on me. "And you, Miss Croft? What do you read when you are not resurrecting dying herb gardens?" The casual reference to our first meeting, the proof that he had seen and remembered every detail, sent a jolt through me. "I read what I can find, Your Grace, but I confess a partiality for the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius." For the first time, the severe line of his mouth softened, almost imperceptibly. "Aurelius, a practical man for impractical times." He walked to a shelf, his movements precise, and pulled down a slim, leather-bound volume. "This is a first edition translation. Perhaps you would care to look at it." As I reached for it, his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, a spark of warmth against my cold skin, but it felt like a brand. The entire room seemed to shrink to that single point of contact. I pulled my hand back as if burned, my heart stuttering. I saw him register my reaction, his jaw tightening slightly before he stepped back, creating a formal distance between us once more. The rest of the visit was a blur. He spoke to me, and only to me, about crop rotation and Seneca, his voice losing some of its icy edge as we talked. My stepmother's face grew thunderous. Serafina, for her part, looked merely bewildered, as if she had stumbled into a play where all the actors were speaking a foreign language. When we left, he escorted us to the door. As I prepared to curtsy, he said, "The book, Miss Croft. You have forgotten it." He was holding out the Aurelius. "Oh, but I couldn't, Your Grace. It is a first edition." "Books are meant to be read, not worshipped behind glass," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I expect to hear your thoughts on the translation when you have finished." I took the book, its weight in my hands feeling both like a treasure and a terrible burden. He was not supposed to see me. He was not supposed to talk to me. And he was certainly not supposed to lend me a priceless book. 2 days later, a cart laden with seasoned oak and coal arrived at our cottage. There was no note. The driver simply said he was instructed to make the delivery and left. Beatrice claimed it was a gesture to the family, a sign of the Duke's burgeoning interest in Serafina, but her voice lacked conviction. I knew it was because he had seen the damp creeping up our walls, because he had felt the chill in our miserable sitting room, because he had noticed my hands were always cold. This secret kindness was a more intimate gesture than any jewel or flower. It was an act of quiet observation, of care. It was terrifying. He began to call on us, always under some thin pretext of estate business. He would speak politely to my father, nod to Beatrice and Serafina, and then he would turn to me. He would ask about the book. He would ask about my day. He would ask for my opinion on a drainage issue in one of his fields. Each conversation was a small, carefully laid stone in a path that was leading somewhere I could not see. During one such visit, in the cramped cottage parlor, he asked, "Miss Croft, I would be pleased if you would call me Julian." The request fell into the silence of the room like a dropped stone. Beatrice gasped. My father choked on his tea. To use a peer's Christian name was a mark of significant intimacy, a privilege granted only to family and the closest of friends. It was a seismic event, and it had been directed at me, the gray moth in the corner. "Julian," I repeated softly, testing the name on my tongue. It felt foreign and powerful. He gave me a small, rare nod of approval, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was this growing, fragile hope that made the discovery all the more devastating. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by a special courier from London. It was addressed to my father, but he opened it in front of me, his hands trembling. I saw the official seal of a solicitor's office. I saw my father's face drain of all color. He crumpled the letter, but not before I saw the words at the top of the page. Regarding the outstanding debt owed to His Grace, the Duke of Alcester. The room tilted. My father, seeing the look on my face, sank into a chair, his bravado finally crumbling into dust. The story came out in a torrent of shame and fear. Years ago, before my mother's death, he had made a series of disastrous investments. To cover the losses, he had borrowed a staggering sum of money. The creditor, a man he had never met, had been ruthless. The terms of the loan, draconian. The collateral for this ruinous debt was Hollyhock Cottage and the small parcel of unentailed land that went with it, the last thing of value our family possessed. When the original creditor had died, the debt had been sold along with his other assets. It had been purchased by the Duke of Alcester. A key turned in a lock I had not known was there, and a cold, dark room in my heart was thrown open. Every moment of the past few weeks replayed in my mind, twisted and corrupted. His sudden appearance, his focus on me, his visits, the kindness. It was all a lie. He was not interested in me. He was inspecting his property. He was the man who held our ruin in the palm of his hand. The book, the firewood, the conversations about philosophy, they were nothing more than the calculated maneuvers of a powerful man assessing his assets. I had been a fool, a vain, naive fool, to think a man like him could see anything of worth in a person like me. The kindness of the powerful, I realized with a sickening lurch, often comes with invisible invoices. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodged beneath my ribs. I did not cry. My grief was too cold, too deep for tears. I took the Aurelius from my bedside table, its fine leather feeling like a snake's skin beneath my fingers. I would return it. I would face him. I would not let him see how thoroughly he had dismantled me. I walked the 2 miles to Blackwood Manor, the wind whipping my cloak around me, the cold a welcome distraction from the storm inside. I did not ask for an audience. I simply told the imposing butler that I was returning something to the Duke. But Julian himself appeared at the top of the grand staircase, halfway through a conversation with his estate manager. He saw me, saw the book in my hand, and the look on my face, and he stopped mid-sentence. He dismissed the other man with a curt nod and descended the stairs, his eyes never leaving mine. "Ilara," he said, using my name for the first time. It felt like a blow. "Your Grace," I corrected him, my voice flat and devoid of all the warmth he had so carefully coaxed into it. I held out the book. "I am returning your property." He did not take it. His gaze was sharp, analytical. "What has happened?" "An education," I replied, a bitter irony lacing the word. "I have learned the true nature of your interest in my family. It seems our presence here is not a social call, but a matter of asset inspection. You must be pleased. The cottage is damp, but the roof is sound enough. A sound investment." A muscle jumped in his jaw. He looked not angry, but weary. "That is what you think this is? A financial calculation?" "What else could it be?" I demanded, my control finally fraying. "You are the Duke of Allister. I am the plain daughter of a man who owes you a fortune. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending your attention was anything but a prelude to foreclosure. Was I a particularly amusing part of the inventory?" He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching my face. I held his gaze, fueled by the righteous anger of my humiliation. I would not look away this time. I would not be the first to break. "The debt is a fact," he said at last, his voice low and grave. "It is an unfortunate piece of business I inherited. I learned of your father's identity as the debtor shortly before your arrival." He took a step closer, and I instinctively flinched back. He stopped. "My inquiries about the cottage were indeed a prelude to finding a way to forgive the entire debt without publicly shaming your father." I stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. "I instructed my solicitor in London 3 days ago," he continued, his voice steady and relentless, "to draw up papers that would transfer the deed to you, Ilara, along with a modest annuity, in exchange for the cancellation of the loan. I was trying to find a way to secure your future, not to ruin it." The anger that had been holding me upright began to dissolve, leaving me shaky and confused. Why would you do that?" "Because everything else," he said, and his voice was raw now, stripped of all its ducal authority, "was a catastrophe I did not plan for." He gestured vaguely around the cavernous hall. "For 7 years, this house has been a tomb. I have been a ghost within it. I did my duty. I ran my estates. I endured. I did not live. I looked at the women your class paraded before me, and I saw nothing. Gowns and jewels and rehearsed smiles. I was not looking for a wife. I was merely waiting for time to pass." He took another step, and this time I did not retreat. "And then I saw you, in a muddy garden with dirt on your cheek, looking at me not with avarice or ambition, but with a guarded curiosity that you tried to hide. You were not brought before me. You were not presented. You just were. Quiet and resilient and real. And in that moment, the world, which had been gray for so long, suddenly had color in it again. Your presence here, in this house, talking about books and crop yields, you did not just bring light into the room, Ilara. You were the light." He finally took the book from my nerveless fingers, placing it on a nearby table. The debt was a complication. Your sister was a distraction. Your stepmother, an irritation. But you, he said, and his voice dropped to a near whisper as he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my face. You were a revelation. You unmade me, Alara Croft. The man I was, the man I had forced myself to be for 7 years, no longer exists. And I confess, it terrifies me. The shard of ice in my chest was gone, replaced by a painful, burgeoning warmth. The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerable confession in his eyes, was undeniable. He was not lying. This was the truth, complex and astonishing and utterly real. I began, my own voice trembling. I had begun to hope. It was all I could offer, but it was enough. The last of the tension in his shoulders seemed to release. Hope is a good place to start, he said softly. It is more than I have had in a very long time. Our alliance was forged in that moment, a silent pact made in the echoing grandeur of his hall. We were no longer Duke and debtor's daughter. We were Julian and Alara, two people who had found an unexpected sanctuary in each other. But our private understanding was one thing, the public reality was another. Beatrice, sensing the prize slipping through her fingers, grew more desperate. She began to circulate subtle, poisonous rumors in the nearby village. That the quiet daughter was sly and manipulative. That she was using unseemly arts to trap the grieving Duke. Julian, hearing these whispers, acted with swift and decisive purpose. He announced a formal dinner at Blackwood, inviting the most prominent local gentry, along with my family. It was to be a stage, I knew, but for what, I was not certain. I was a nervous wreck, but Julian's calm confidence was a bastion. He sent his own modiste to our cottage with bolts of silk, and I was dressed not as a moth, but in a gown the color of a twilight sky, a deep velvety blue that made my eyes seem darker and my skin less pale. When Julian saw me that evening at the top of the stairs, the look in his eyes was one of such profound and undisguised admiration that I felt beautiful for the first time in my life. The dinner was a tense affair. My stepmother was on her most charming behavior, directing the conversation constantly towards Seraphina's beauty and accomplishments. Julian was a model of polite civility, but his attention, his small smiles, his quiet questions were all for me. The other guests noticed. The whispers were no longer about my slyness, but about the Duke's obvious and singular preference. It was in the drawing room, over coffee, that Beatrice made her move. She cornered the vicar's wife, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by half the room. One does worry, of course. A man in his position, so vulnerable in his grief. It is a tragedy when a clever, ambitious girl takes advantage of such a situation. Alara has always been determined. The insinuation hung in the air, thick and venomous. The room fell silent. This was it, the moment of my public ruin. But before I could even form a reply, Julian set his cup down with a deliberate, sharp click. He rose to his full, imposing height. "Your concern for my welfare is touching, Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "But it is entirely misplaced." He crossed the room and came to stand beside me, his hand resting lightly, possessively, on the back of my chair. "Let me be perfectly clear to all of you so that there are no further misunderstandings. I am not being taken advantage of. For the first time in 7 years, I am making a choice. I have asked Miss Alara Croft to be my wife, and she has done me the great honor of accepting." A collective gasp went through the room. Beatrice's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, My father looked as if he might faint. Julian was not finished. He looked directly at my father. As to the matter of ambition, I believe that is a trait more accurately ascribed to your own household, Mr. Croft. Specifically, regarding the rather significant debt you owe my estate. A debt I had offered to forgive on the most generous of terms, an offer which, I see now, was perhaps misinterpreted as a weakness to be exploited. The exposure was total. The greed, the desperation, the lies, all laid bare in a few precise sentences. Beatrice looked from Julian's cold, implacable face to my own, and her shock curdled into pure,